Yeah, so guess which one's the Note 9? So I guess we did gain some screen space with the Note 9 being like just a tiny bit less chinless than the original, which is pretty cool. But yeah, those are the whites. It's held up pretty damn well over the time. I've had the Note 8 for about, I'd say 2 years. Note 9 after, about a year. Off screen a little bit. Okay, so burn-in would be there. Dark mode tends to happen whenever there's sharp lines that persist. And I actually did typically leave this on because I like having quick access. But the easiest way to do some tests is just to go here. Go here, 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 here. Leaves you in diagnostic modes. Same thing here. Call. Dut, 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 dut. Dut, dut. And I'm a pretty heavy phone user, so pretty glad to say I haven't gotten any issue with burn-in. Even when I had an issue, I got a cracked screen. Over time, the tempering solution that it's made out of a potassium ion wears off, just kind of like the windshield on your car, how it's perfectly shiny once you drive it off the lot, and after a while, it might take a few pebbles, but then, you know, that final pebble hits and then you get the spider line crack. The screen softens over time. I wouldn't necessarily call it planned obsolescence. That's just kind of how glass works with tempered glass with screens, you know, this thin. It's pretty miraculous actually that we could have a screen this thin that could actually be this fault tolerant. I mean, the way it cracked, it's still pretty stable. You can see that, you know, I dropped it pretty bad. I started not caring as much about it and just using it without the case. So unfortunately it took a bad tumble, crack there. But the cracks kind of do seem to be holding pretty steady. Where it ends there, it doesn't seem like it's continuing to travel as you would see like on a, you know, like a windshield. But yeah, I would say that the screens on these are much better. I mean, given that it's another generation apart, it's brighter. Hard to tell on camera, it's very deceptive because of the camera itself has a white balance sensor. So the screens adjust their white balance, your camera also adjusts its white balance. So, you know, be that as it may, it's pretty hard to do a very scientific comparison. Oh, was this on the entire time? Let me actually turn off this thing. Yeah, because that's kind of cheating. So yeah, I'm going to turn off the bottom. Okay, so back to white. Alright, there we go. So that's the true bottom of the screen. So yeah, I don't really have any screen burn-in. So leaving it on 1080p does work in the long run as far as keeping you from getting any of those sharp lines to cut your screen over time and allowing the green pixels to do their job by being doubled and just sharing power. I could do the same thing with red, green. Green's the most susceptible to burn-in. So, in general, if you wanted to reverse burn-in, you'd actually want to use purple, ironically. because it's whatever's left over, right? So I mean, if your whites are leaving you with magenta, which is purple, it's a, you know, red plus blue. The way you reverse that is by getting the other pixels to wear evenly to catch up. It's almost like having a bunch of candles of different lengths. How would you get all the candles to then be the same length? You'd want to burn the longer candles down to reach the same length as the shortest candle. Same principle. Yeah, so generally speaking, reds burn slower than blue, but greens burn the fastest. Due to their being the brightest, they actually double the pixel, and our eyes actually detect green brighter than it detects red and blue, which is interesting because doubling the pixels allows for the greens to also be a lot brighter in general than any of the other colors, because there's literally 2 times as many pixels as there are red and green. But their choice to actually allow for their screens to be not a squid, square, but a pentile, which is not unprecedented. That's actually how CRT TVs are. And the benefits aren't just that it allows for more efficient pixel clustering per the new technology, but it allows for a lot more flexible screen scaling. When you have a screen array where everything is in a square and you wanted to do a resolution that is in between something that isn't a divisible number, a round divisible number like half of 1080p, then you would end up with that problem you have with LCD screens you've probably seen before, or IPS screens, where between the resolutions that are optimal, they tend to look all blurry. And that's why. It's because it's actually having to force the pixel array over a grid that isn't actually compatible. With pentile displays, there really aren't pixels. There's subpixels. And then there's subpixel clusters. So the way that it emulates an actual pixel is by clustering whatever happens to be within that region. And whatever happens to be within that region could be subdivided into any number you want. So you go into 720p, you go into 2K, go into 1080p, and whichever. I mean, I bet you if they wanted to be wacky, they could allow you to have all sorts of weird resolutions in between. Haven't tried messing around with that, but there's nothing that RGBG, RGBG, there it is, pentile displays can't actually display. Just like the same way a CRT TV, when you play those old video games, they'll look beautiful. The thing is that when you watch the movies on like an N64 versus the gameplay, you'll notice you're actually watching different resolutions. And they did a lot of shortcuts like that. And that was actually something that was done specifically because CRT doesn't have pixels. It actually has a display much more like RGBG, more like a pentile display, where it's not a cluster but something more like a star of subpixels. So I don't know, maybe we should just like stop calling things pixels, or at least retroactively start naming the trinitone pixel something else, and start calling subpixels themselves pixels, and then call the actual clusters pixel clusters, because I feel like the term pixel is outdated now that we're not really using anymore. And there were actually some inherent disadvantages to pixels as they were, especially with things like quantum dots and stuff nowadays, where there's actually like a white pixel array in the background in a lot of them that allows for like white and RGB. But something that's also very cool about these RGBG pentile displays is it's very similar to CMYK, the way that a magazine prints. If you look closely at the way that a magazine prints, it doesn't print in a grid the way that your home printer prints. It prints with a bunch of round dots that are overlaid, and they're not actually in a square. And that prevents any sort of anti-aliasing. It prevents any sort of, and it allows for any array of, I guess, resolutions, as you might call them, depending on whatever the photographer took, to be scaled and then printed, and it doesn't cause any issues, any artifacts. The picture turns out fine, however the editor wants to scale it in the article. That's why magazines all look great. It's because they aren't reliant on a grid display. And that's why a lot of people still collect those old CRT TVs for like video game playing and stuff, which is actually really fun. I got one, and I play like those old emulators on them. But yeah, the point I was trying to make was pretty much just there's a big difference between AMOLED, and I remember about 2 years ago we used to have this debate over what AMOLED was versus what IPS was, and due to not understanding how AMOLED worked, we used to believe that the backlight would go from a cool blue to pink, the same way a phosphorescent light in like a warehouse, something like that, as it wears out. Or you might remember, like in some schools, if you look up at the ceiling, you'll see pinkish bulbs and bluish bulbs. And the reason why is because as it wears out, blue energy is a higher energy wavelength. It loses energy over time. It becomes more of a neutral color, and then it becomes pink, which is the lowest energy wavelength. That transmitted over to the way that we treat AMOLED displays, presuming that there was a backlight. So then people started complaining about the whites not being consistent, believing that there was some fixed white that wasn't fixed, so that people were getting better or worse backlighting or something like that. When the truth was that, given that in any circumstance the white balance on your phone was constantly being adjusted by an ambient lighting sensor, there was basically no chance that they would match, because it's dynamically generating the white depending on what looks white. I mean, if you look at this piece of paper, right? This piece of paper right now actually kind of has a bluish tint to it, to my eyes at least. To the camera it might not, but white's relative. If I took it outside, it'd have a bluer tint, especially before noon. If I took it outside during the sunset, it'd have an orange tint. But to my eyes, it would always look white, because that's just what we accept as white. We take white as whatever is the most neutral in the context of the lighting. You take a white piece of paper into a room with only red lights, the white paper will look red, because that's the only color that's available. But if you add another color, then you'll start being able to tell the difference between which of the pages are white versus another color. But yeah, I remember it being like a really heated topic actually, and you can still find the how Pentel AMOLEDs work display thread, and there was a lot of heated discussion there at the time, and it was like the first time that we covered how there was actually that dynamic white adjusting feature that was just gonna calculate its white balance based off of the light around you, which is the most readily apparent for me, especially if I'm like sitting on a train or something. As the windows, as the trees are passing by, you can actually watch the whites change colors over time. And it was a really cool feature that was very much uncovered. And I actually managed to find an S5, and I tracked the technology back that far. The S5 actually had the dynamic white feature that eventually got, I guess, christened or codified as what we now know as True Tone. And that's kind of what we called back then, was that as soon as it became mainstream, AMOLED became mainstream, i.e. was accepted by Apple. I don't have anything against Apple, I actually like Apple, I'm just saying.
You know, once it became something that was accepted by Apple, it became mainstream, and so people then understood that the new technology of how AMOLED worked, and they gave the feature that used to be considered a defect a name, called it True Tone, and then it was kind of just accepted as normal. Other than that, Samsung did everything they could. They acknowledged that the whites are gonna naturally deviate, and that was kind of seen as being an admittal that they had a problem, but it wasn't, because the second paragraph goes on to explain how the whites use the lighting around your environment to adjust its whites on the go. And that paragraph wasn't ever, for some reason, cited. Only the part where they just said that their whites vary was cited. So it sounded very much like they were admitting that, there was a problem. And then so they added the ability to adjust the whites yourself if you wanted to. So the whites already adjust themselves, and then you too can then override that by rendering your whites cooler or warmer depending on how you want it. Because, like if I were to go and stand under a red light and I had my whites not change colors, it would appear blue, because everything else around me looks warm. And if the white actually stayed neutral, it would actually have what's called the blue tint problem at the time. And that's what the dynamic whites actually solved, was the blue tint problem. And the screen becoming pinkish or warm whenever it was under a warm lighting, which is pretty much anytime you're under the sky, pretty much past 1, or you're under the rooftop of some comfortable dwelling, the lighting tends to be warm. It's only really office lighting, warehouse lighting, where it's you get really white whites or like bluish whites, because those are actually naturally very uncomfortable. And I'd say about 90% of the time you actually have warm lighting around you. So 90% of the time you are going to have your white balance adjust to kind of a more pinkish tone. So it was never really a problem to begin with. It was just doing its job. Just like carry around a white piece of paper, and most likely it'll actually be more reddish or more pinkish or more warm throughout the day. Whereas before noon, which is when the sun is actually at its whitest, then you could actually, and if your paper happens to be pure white, then that's the only time you're going to experience pure white, is before noon, when the atmosphere is like, really thin and all the vapor and everything hasn't risen up yet. But yeah, that's just kind of a retrospective on like the nitty gritty of like what the kind of stuff we covered in the past. And then we did a post on how people felt about knowing that it was a feature versus a defect, because what's interesting was that due to the misunderstanding that the way the whites work, people would go, walk up to their buddies who were coming in from outside, and they would be inside all day or something, whatever, and so they would hold the phones next to each other, so they're both, at the moment adjusted to whatever is appropriate. So lo and behold, hold the phone side by side, the whites don't look the same. So one of them would be unhappy, believing that they should look the same. So it was a game of numbers, that odds are no one would ever be happy if they thought that the whites weren't supposed to deviate. The whites refresh, not like as fast as it did on an S5. It has a sample rating of about once a minute it'll adjust, and it does it very subtly now. It used to actually go pretty far. When you look back at the S5 video, which I'll link, it used to actually go pretty much as far as it needs to go. But then they started adding more of a limitation as far as like how wide it'll go, because we added the blue light filter. So if you wanted to have more of an auburn sort of tint, you could just turn on the blue light filter anyway. But yeah, that's a short little history of what cool stuff we could do just by spreading information online, where when people came, they were like RMAing their brand new devices, literally buying their brand new devices, taking them out of the boxes, comparing them to a buddy, and unhappy because of a feature that they didn't know was a feature, thought was a defect, and then returned it and got a warranty swap instead, and that meant they ended up with a refurbished phone. And you had a whole bunch of people just returning their phones for no reason, and it just caused like just a whole bunch of e-waste and just pointlessness, and it was just stupid. So then suddenly, once people realized that it was a feature, that something that was gonna appear on the iPhone like 3 years later, they were much happier to know about it, and especially knowing that the thing is a cool piece of technology. I mean, to understand something is just to appreciate it more, really. You know, it's like when you know that something is supposed to work the way it does, and it does work, and the reason why it works, you end up happier. And then we did a follow-up post, and people who knew about the way the white balance would automatically adjust according to the ambient lighting were much happier to know about it. And the upvotes made it very clear that they would have thought that this thing was a defect. That's because everyone was saying it was a defect at the time. And they ended up happier knowing it wasn't a defect. That they actually had something cool. So that just shows you how much of like a shift of perspective you can have. These phones are actually just like what I call them is like the Disneyland of technology. They're always like pretty much the most advanced technology you can have. This display right here is actually cut up, and it's the same display you'd end up with on the next generation monitors. The price of this slice is pretty damn expensive considering how dense the pixels are. Multiply that by the size of a monitor, and that's why monitors are so expensive. And then eventually, once those get cheap enough, you start slicing them up and you end up with AMOLED TVs. And that's why AMOLED TVs are so expensive for like the higher res ones. But you'll never have the TV be the same resolution as the phone, because the phone will always sell the smallest piece of the display, and that will be the highest resolution that you're going to possibly have. And that pretty much applies for everything else. That, your phone is pretty much like your computer nowadays. It's the most personal computer you're going to ever have. You carry around with you. Has all these sensors, has everything you need, and especially paired with like a smartwatch or something, it's basically like a pocket satellite. And the technology that these things have packed in there, knowing about what each of them are capable of, is just the start of it. Because once you know about the way everything works and the way it evolved, it also allows you to do all sorts of stuff that wasn't even intended by the developer, by mix and matching all the different features. I mean, I was able to get the Daydream working originally before the Pixel was even supposed to have it as a non-exclusive, because when the first Pixel was released, it actually had Daydream as an exclusive feature. It was the first Pixel-ready device. At the time, the S7 didn't support it. But using Knox, there was an unintended feature called Chaos Mode. And Chaos Mode basically makes it so that any app gets locked onto your screen. So guess how I got Pixel to work? Guess how I got the Daydream to work? So without having to root, just using Knox, I was able to get all the exclusive Pixel apps to work, because it just would work. I mean, it's running on a burner emulated. It's not emulated. It's running on a burner version of Android within Android, because that's what a Knox container is. That's what your secure container, your secure folder is. And it's just running it as if it's not even really on software. It's almost like you're running off of like an Android dev kit or something. And so you could set that thing up any way you want. And it was pretty fun playing with Daydream at the time, before, when people were still hassling people to root and to figure out ways to like get some kind of mishmash of the Pixels ROM ported onto the S7 when you didn't have to do that at all. You just had to just use Nox, create what at the time was actually, and the S7 was actually capable of 3 different Nox environments. I think it was, I forget what it was called, but it had the secure folder, but there was also, I think it was called just Nox or something, Nox folder, but you could download it, and I wrote it in my original Nox guide, but you could download it and install it, and it will actually create another secure folder. But at the time, the thing even had more features, and especially if you had the Nox dev kit, you could do a lot of stuff with that thing. That's how you do things like, you know, the Disconnect Pro app. You use a Nox dev kit. Nox allows you to do all sorts of stuff that's basically exclusive to Nox enabled devices, which isn't just Galaxies. It's only the S series Galaxies and above that support Nox, because it needs to actually have all the hardware that's necessary for it to work. But yeah, I'm gonna start covering a lot more of all these really cool features that you could find on these devices, just due to the fact that they have just so many capabilities that you could actually mix and match and just do all sorts of weird stuff with. I remember making a post about Game Booster, which is it's supposed to be for gaming, but you know, like there's a lot of apps that are actually kind of very game-like. Video processing apps, a lot of stuff that has, you know, very high GPU or CPU resource usage, something that you definitely don't want to close in the background, something that you want some, you know, some auxiliary controls for, even a quick access camera to record what you're doing. You could apply Game Booster to anything, and doing that would actually give you the ability to do per app customizations. So I've been pushing for Samsung to actually add an app booster similar to Game Booster, because there's a lot of apps that actually work like Game Booster. So I'm hoping we can start up a community where we kind of start getting, you know, Samsung to do what we want again. Hopefully maybe add the headphone jack. But besides that, it's just fun showing all the cool things that, you know, I figure out how to do. And at the time, there were all of these other people I'm gonna reach out to that were also figuring out all these other cool things to do. And plus, like, you know, debunking all these myths that were just being spread and for whatever reason wouldn't go away. But we were able to like do some tag teaming with one of us, you know, willing to root our devices to demonstrate the differences between a device that's unrooted and rooted, and to show that, you know, even if you did try to get rid of Nox, it's not going to save you any battery because it's not really an actual app. But yeah, stay tuned and thanks. And I hope you enjoy the stuff I come up with.